Thank you, Noah, for coming on and joining me on the show today. I appreciate you taking the time. You are a blogger, have one of the most popular newsletters on Substack called No Opinion. Prior to that, spent some time as a columnist at Bloomberg and in academia at Stony Brook University. A lot of people know you from Twitter. Others will have read your Substack, but for those who aren't familiar with you and your background, I think it'd be great to just start with your story from as early as you're willing to start to where you are today and some of the decisions you made along the way.
Well, my story starts with the British comedy Fawlty Towers. Do you know that one?
I do not, but sounds like an interesting place to start.
It was a landmark show. Like comedians will all know Fawlty Towers, but my parents were in a hotel watching Fawlty Towers, and my mom laughed so hard that her water broke, and then I was born.
So we're starting really at the beginning.
Yeah, you said start at the beginning.
Love it.
Then other things happened, and then eventually 18 years later, well, I moved to Texas 6 weeks later, so I don't remember. That was in Oklahoma. Actually, I was born in Oklahoma. Lived there 6 weeks. Can't remember a bit of it, obviously. And then went to Texas, where I grew up. And 18 years later, came out to California for college. Then went to Japan after that for 3 years, and lived in Japan, and had silly adventures, whatever. And then came back to University of Michigan for graduate school. Got a PhD in economics. Started my blog while I was a graduate student, and then went to be a professor for a couple of years at Stony Brook University in New York. Continued the blog then. Bloomberg called me up and offered to pay me to write for them. So I did that, and moved out to California, where I've been there since. And then a couple of years ago, I started doing the Substack newsletter. And I wouldn't say that it's, taken off. I look at other Substackers' growth curves, and it's this giant surge, like Matt Iglesias or Scott Alexander or some of these other, Substackers. They just, within like a couple months, they got 6,000, 12,000 paid subscribers or something. And for me, I started off with like 100. Like no one was reading, no one was paying for my Substack. And so it's been over 2 years. It's just been, a sort of a steady, linear, arduous climb for me to reach, because I'm just terrible at marketing. I'm just not very good as like a media self-marketing person, I guess. But it's steadily grown. And so I think that means that there's some sort of fundamental appeal there, although I don't know exactly what it is that people like about my writing, but hopefully they keep liking it.
Yeah, it's interesting. A couple questions on the story there, but I want to start with sort of the latest point you made. I looked up something, maybe didn't do as good of diligence as I had thought, but I thought that No Opinion was one of the more popular newsletters on Substack. Maybe that's not the case, but I'm curious with I think it's certainly one of the ones that I see cited more often. Maybe I just sort of have a bias on the types of people I'm following and listening to and things, but I think
Well, in
about the
terms of
marketing. Go ahead.
yeah, in terms of audience size, it is one of the most popular ones. But since I charge money for fewer posts than other people do, um, then since I charge money for fewer ones, I have fewer paid subscribers than some. Like there's a few big politics substackers who have, they make the most money. They make like millions of dollars a year. And I don't make millions of dollars a year, although, hopefully at some point. But then I think that my audience size is just as large as theirs in terms of how many people are getting my emails in their inboxes every day.
I see. And so is there a trade-off there where you sort of like obviously you're aware of the fact that these people are charging for more of their articles. Are you making a conscious trade-off that you want to have the top of the funnel, sort of the free subscribers, continue to grow as much as possible, and then you always sort of have the option to toggle on, more paid pieces when you want to?
Yeah, sure. I can do that.
Yeah.
So I'm more interested in getting a lot of people to read my stuff.
Yeah. Makes sense. So, rewinding a bit, you were at Bloomberg, like you mentioned. you decided to, you'd been blogging for years though, continued the blog when you were at Stony Brook, etc. Um, I'm curious, the decision to move over to Substack, and Substack, to me at least, seems to be somewhat of a new generation of independent writers. What do you think made it unique? What do you like about it? What might you change about it? Just curious to hear your thoughts on the platform, having been there now for a little over 2 years, I think.
About Substack itself?
Yeah.
Well, so Substack's main, advantage is email distribution. They do free email distribution and also growth. So Substack is very good about building an ecosystem. So, if you're on Substack, then other people, people who read other Substacks will see you through recommendations and, whatever. And then there's various methods by which Substack encourages people who subscribe to one Substack to subscribe to others. So they build this little community ecosystem, things like that. So that's useful for growing your audience. And so those two things are really worth it for me. In terms of the bargain, like it's a good service. They also help you like set up the business and payments side and all this stuff. And they provide a few other services to like help the writers. So it's a good deal. But basically, I think the deeper question is the question about where the newsletter, the sort of advent of newsletters, has, where that leaves the media ecosystem, the print media ecosystem. Because why, people might think, why do you need the New York Times? Why do you need whatever? There's a couple answers to that. So news coverage is not going to migrate and be independent because news coverage is a collective cooperative enterprise for which the benefits that you get from working with a large organization and the specialization within that organization makes a lot of sense. Maybe sometime in the future, we'll have instant, smooth outsourcing where you can just like hire editors and checkers and all the other people and marketers and just at the touch of a button. And that ecosystem may grow and then ultimately displace all sort of integrated news organizations like Bloomberg or whatever. That may happen. But but for now, you can't really get news from independent writers. And the independent journalists are often that you see are often one of two types. They're either access journalists who just know a few people, they have a couple good sources, and they keep calling those few good sources up to get a scoop really quick in a narrow area, right? You see that. And then you also see some people who are of questionable quality, who are quote unquote journalists, who are actually opinion writers masquerading as journalists. And I won't name names, obviously. But then the quality of their information is very low. And because anyone can call themselves a journalist and just claim facts and cite rumors, and that a lot of that does happen. And but I think that where Substack really shines is not for people who report the news; it's for opinion writers like me. And an opinion writer, I've long maintained that opinion writers are a different layer of media from journalists. That opinion writers are not journalists. We don't gather information. We gather some information in terms of like reading papers. We don't really gather primary information. What we do is we collate and assemble the information that other people gather, whether it's by writing an academic paper or writing a journalistic news article or whatever, or even another blog post. And we analyze it and we synthesize it into comprehensible, packaged, I could say narratives, but it's really just analysis. So what we actually are is more like a CIA analyst. So CIA analysts take all the information that's gathered by the agents in the field, and they sort of synthesize that into some easily comprehensible narratives about like what's going on in other countries, and then send that to their higher ups. And so that's basically what the people we call opinion writers are actually analysts, and they're doing that for the general public, sort of like an open source, CIA analyst kind of thing. I was surprised when I met some CIA analysts to find out that they had the same job as me. They just wrote for a different audience, but they did exactly the same thing. And so I think that's where we are. And that has no real reason to be bundled with a publication. There's no reason why Paul Krugman doesn't gain, the only thing Paul Krugman gains from being at the New York Times is marketing, right? The reason why Substack writers won't displace major media publications soon is not actually about quality. It's about bundling, because you have to pay, the amount you pay for a single Substack is maybe 1/3, or in some cases, even 1/2 of what you'd pay for a major media publication. So if you really just want to read one person every day, then that's great. Those people subscribe to a bunch of Substacks, or maybe just one Substack. If you have a lot of money, you could subscribe to a lot of Substacks. But the point is, your average person who wants to read some opinion writing and analysis every day, if you want to read a whole bunch of different writers every day and not pay much money, you subscribe to a publication, right? If what you want to read is like op-eds, you want to read op-eds from like 12 different people or 40 different people, and you want to not pay that much money for it. You don't want to pay for 40 different Substack subscriptions. Well, instead you subscribe to the Wall Street Journal, or New York Times, or any of those, and then you get a whole bunch of these things. And so Substack will probably filter away some of the more popular writers. So, if you have a big popular following, then essentially you have no reason not to go independent, because people would rather just read your stuff all day. Like, people would rather just read Matt Iglesias than read like 20 different New York Times people. There are, so in that sense, some of the more popular writers will be all drawn to go independent, and that will have a sort of a selection effect, where the people who remain at the big publications are less popular. They're sort of more like, fade into a crowd kind of people. So you might even end up with this equilibrium where people go to major publications as sort of their first career move as an opinion writer. And then if they make it, if people like their stuff, then they go indie, and then they leave the New York Times, and then they go to Substack.
Yeah, that's an interesting overview, and is a very like clear way of laying it out, I think. And a couple questions sort of coming out of it. One is, I've thought of sort of what you just described a little bit in the context of like education as well, especially when COVID flipped things to remote, like fully remote for universities in particular for a while. I was like, some of these more like popular professors, every university sort of has like their few most popular professors and whatnot. And like, I was wondering, can those people split off? I didn't really see it happen too much. Maybe it happened, and I just really wasn't aware of it. But can these like really
Professors?
popular professors split off, and, you don't need to leverage the Harvard name or the Michigan name or whatever the university might be. You just have enough sort of respect for yourself, whether it's from online or just university reputation, whatever it is, you can go and do your own thing and make a heck of a lot more money doing, online education. There can be a physical component as well or whatever, but you can sort of like do your own thing. And maybe it's not in the context of like on your way to a college degree, but it's just people who are interested in learning from that individual and willing to pay the price for it.
Yeah, but remember that professors are primarily researchers, not teachers. Like, a professor teaches, but a professor's main job is to do research, at least at an R1 university.
So does that break the,
It
what I
absolutely
was saying,
does.
basically that makes that not feasible from your perspective?
Yep. Um, and so basically what's going on there is that professors are with an institution because it allows them to do research. Um, yeah. And so you could imagine unbundling the university, but it would be very, very difficult. A lot of stuff has to happen before that university unbundling happens. But most people think of professors primarily as teachers because that's how they interact with professors. You go to undergrad, you take classes from a professor, you think this is the professor's job. The professor can't wait to be done teaching that class so they can get back to their labs, writing their papers.
Yeah. Does it depend? I mean, maybe, I'm one of those people that you just named, but does it depend on sort of the discipline, how much of their time and energy is weighted towards research versus teaching?
Mm, maybe it should, ideally, but in practice it doesn't, because research is what gets professors what they really want, which is intellectual prestige among their peers.
Sure.
You don't get any prestige for teaching. Um, in fact, you lose a little prestige for teaching, although you shouldn't, because teaching is great, because it helps you solidify the basic concepts that you may have forgotten just doing advanced stuff, and it makes you explain stuff over and over so that you are always understanding the basic concepts as you're doing your research. So it is useful for the professors, but they don't think it is, and professors typically hate teaching. Some professors like teaching. I shouldn't say that, but it's kind of a samey sort of thing. It's the same every year. It's routine. And you notice that when you look at lecturers or adjuncts who just do teaching and don't do research with the university, those people get paid a lot less, and they get almost no intellectual prestige from what they do. Like you find someone who's an Econ 101 lecturer that all they do is teach econ, and that no one is going to listen to what that person thinks about the economy, right? Unless they're a popular blogger as well. But no one's gonna listen to them just because they're a lecturer who teaches Econ 101. They're very low on the status totem pole. The way you get high on the intellectual status totem pole is research, not teaching. So that's what professors think that their real job is, even as other people just sort of see them as teachers.
Yeah, it's sorry, go ahead.
No, that's it. Yeah.
Oh yeah. It's interesting. I like didn't know this, and I'm just thinking about it like, obviously sort of education, arguably when you're younger, but I would say like, through college and stuff, it's like pretty important. And to think about it as just a second priority for everyone who's responsible for delivering it. Um, like how did that, is that problematic from your perspective or
Well, it is a
um
bit weird, right? Because you've got people who, have this dual job. And what happens when one part becomes more important than the other? Like, what if we need a bunch of teachers, but then we run out of research to do in a field? What if we need a bunch of people to learn history, but then historical research has basically run its course to the point where people are now just inventing bullshit, revisionist theories about how actually like the Nazis were good or whatever. Well, I mean, probably not, but they invent stupid revisionist theories all the time. And maybe people have to keep churning out that stupid revisionism and actually reducing our aggregate stock of knowledge because they're using it as a signaling device to get a job that's fundamentally just a teaching job that any lecturer should be able to do. And so that's on one side. On the other side, you can have people whose main job is research, being required to teach classes, to teach a bunch of classes, and that's taking them away from their research. You could have that as well. You can also the way the hiring works doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense because professors are hired, based on their research that they've done. It's your publication record that gets you hired, not your teaching ability. Your teaching experience and blah 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 is like way down the list. And so professors get hired based on research. So that might mean people are not getting taught by people who are hired because they're good teachers. It might be the lecturer is actually better at teaching some classes. And so this weird bundling that we've created, which is a historical accident because we basically did it by combining two university systems into one. The way we, and I can tell that story, it's pretty brief, but then this weird hybrid system doesn't necessarily this isn't necessarily the way we should always do it. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe you can just tell that story if it is brief, because I don't know it, and I think a lot of people probably don't.
So basically, universities began as two different things, the British system and the German system. And the British system was very focused on liberal arts education. Basically, you had highly respected sort of humanities professors teaching, being like these sages who would teach the usually rich young people, things at like Cambridge and Oxford and whatever. You teach them philosophy and the classics and blah blah blah. Liberal arts education, sort of a finishing school for, the aristocracy and wannabe aristocracy and rich people. That's how it started, right? It eventually became much more inclusive, and then you can go to college for free no matter who you are, and blah blah blah. But at the beginning, it was this liberal arts education, and focused on teaching. And then in Germany, you had this scientific research universities that did teaching, but the teaching was primarily practical education, of like, we do chemistry here, we do chemistry research, and we're going to teach you how to do chemistry research, so then you can do chemistry research with us. So it's all about research, the German universities. And America basically took those things and just mashed them together. So our undergraduate education is very much British, in that we emphasize a general education. We want to create well-rounded individuals. We teach humanities and all that stuff. And then, and people really, really complain when I have to take technical classes as well. And then for the graduate education, it's very much the old German model where it's like, we're training you for a research job. you're essentially apprenticed researchers as a grad student, and you're taught this because you're going to actually do it, right? You're not just getting general educated so you can go out there, be a middle manager somewhere in middle America, and like, now you know something about economics too, and you know about history. Cool, you're you know more. But it's not, it's that's the sort of British model. And then the German model is like, we train grad students in chemistry so you can do chemistry research.
Yeah, I did know like or at least I thought that the German model generally is like a little bit more of like an apprenticeship type of thing. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
Germany's always been very apprenticeship focused.
yeah, and I
You
didn't
do
realize
apprentice
that.
yeah.
Go ahead.
No, sorry.
I was just gonna say I didn't realize like sort of the history of university as you laid it out, but it sort of makes sense. So going back to the media bit, how do you think, people obviously like the trends, if you see on any of the charts, like their institutional trust seems to be going down generally. One of these institutions is media, certainly not the only one. But, in a world where people, and correct me if you disagree with the premise, but in a world where people are losing trust in like the media brands, which, used to maybe be very helpful for giving a no-name writer that sort of trust implicitly because they're a part of the brand. When that's sort of flipped on its head and people don't trust the institution anymore, the media institution, is it easier to sort of find an individual that you can trust, whether it's you or Matt Iglesias or whoever it might be on Substack, and sort of concentrate your information, input to, or the output that you take in to like a few individuals rather than blindly trusting publications? Or how do you think about those sort of elements and how they play off of each other? And is it going to be more of like a balance, where, you do subscribe to a few individuals, but then you have the publications that you like for sort of the general news? Because this stuff, it's very important, like where people get their information and whose opinions they read. It sort of informs their own perspectives. And I would think that this, changing media landscape that we have, whether it's Substacks or podcasts or whatever it might be, this emerging class of prominent individuals who have audiences the sizes of traditional media publication brands, it seems to maybe have a possibility of changing things quite a bit. I'm curious to hear your perspective on that.
Uh, Honestly, I don't know. Like, I don't actually have much of a perspective. You might say I have no opinion on this. I don't know why trust in media has decreased, to be honest. I think it's easy to tell this story where we used to have a few big sort of government sanctioned public, like broadcasting companies like ABC, CBS, NBC, and then you had the big newspapers, which were very concentrated because of the difficulty of distributing a large print publication. Meant you really tended toward just having a few of them. You have your local paper, but you have these giant national papers. And so then media was really concentrated because of this. And you could say that caused everyone to just kind of, trust the media because they didn't see a lot of alternative sources who said, no, CBS lies, and if you just didn't see that, then maybe you'd suspect that you weren't being fed the exact truth, but then you'd have no real alternatives. So you'd be, yeah, sure, I trust the media. But then, after you had fragmentation, after you had the end of the fairness doctrine, after you had various laws that allowed more competition in the media space, and after you had, of course, the internet, then no matter what a media publication does, you're going to have people just screaming that it's lying all the time, right? So anything that I write, someone's out there screaming that it's a lie, right? And so Substack's interesting when you bring it into this equation, because Substack, because you have to subscribe to, a few expensive publications, it might be that people trust the media because now they're seeing now the media becomes, like 3-4 Substackers instead of like a million people arguing and screaming at each other. So maybe that will help. But then at the same time, you're still going to have social media. And no matter what people say, you're going to have people out there yelling like, it's all a lie. The media lies to you. And of course, people yell this on both sides, right? Like Democrats yell this, Republicans yell this, and they each, of course, they each think that their media is trustworthy and that the other media is just a hellhole of partisan lies. And so, I don't know if that situation on social media is going to be fixed anytime soon, or what could fix that. I think that if I had to guess why trust in the media has fallen, it's just that our media ecosystem allows, opportunistic shouters to just denounce any media story that comes out. So you're constantly seeing anything denounced.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think so. I mean, basically, you're saying that, I mean, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth or whatever, but if I'm sort of hearing you right, the media has not changed materially in terms of, these big publications, but in terms of their accuracy or their style or anything like this. But um, there's just simply much more room for counter arguments. And moreover, the most extreme, like shouters, basically are, tend to get engagement and things like this. And so, um, whether it's, the left or the right, there's always someone on the other side who basically wants to denounce the whole thing, and no one knows basically what to trust when they're seeing all of that.
Right. Yeah. I think, yeah, that's pretty much it. Um,
Right.
in other words, no matter what you trust now, you've got to trust something that a lot of people will be very audibly screaming is a lie. To trust any media, however true it is, however it isn't. I don't actually know how much the actual quality of media has changed. I hear people say the New York Times has gotten worse, but I've never really read the New York Times, to be honest. I I have, I think the New York Times is kind of mediocre, to be honest. And then yeah, I think it's, but it's really big, so it'd be difficult not to be mediocre because it's just sort of this giant omnibus paper. And so yeah, so I think, I don't know if it's changed. I can tell you that in the years since I started working at Bloomberg until now, when I no longer do, I think that Bloomberg's quality as a journalistic organization has improved. That's the publication with which I have the greatest intimacy and familiarity. And I will tell you that Bloomberg News has gotten better. Bloomberg Opinion lost, some people, but including myself, obviously. But then Bloomberg News, just the journalism aspect of it, has gotten better over the years. But then, better doesn't mean perfect. I mean, so the thing about news is that it's the name comes from the word new. And so what that means is that you're getting information really, really fast. Right? You're getting information fast. And when you get information fast from people who are generalists who don't, deeply know what's going on, journalists, know something about like tech or finance or geopolitics or whatever they're reporting on, but they don't know as much as the people who are actually doing it, because usually, they often have a reporting beat. And so they try to do their best, but you're always going to have a little more speed and generalness and lack of fact checking and lack of like pondering. There's a speed accuracy trade-off in information. And that's true whether it's news or financial trading signals or whatever you want. There's a speed accuracy trade-off. The faster you get information, the noisier it's going to be. And that's true for news. And so I would estimate that about 50% of what you read in the news is not true. Mostly it's because journalists just don't understand what's going on. Sometimes it's because journalists sort of fill in the gaps because they have to like create a narrative. Occasionally it's because journalists like try to push a bullshit narrative, although I think that's much, much rarer than people think it is. But I would say mostly it's just people don't know what's going on. So there's a fog of war, if you will. And so because of that, I would estimate 50% of news is wrong. And that's better. That's a lot better than you would get just not knowing anything, right? Because it's not like we're talking about news isn't like a coin flip or something where 50% is just even odds. In fact, news tells you stuff that you wouldn't have even known otherwise. And then 50% is wrong, but then 50% is a lot to get wrong. And so you're always going to be able to find bullshit in the news, no matter how well it's done or no matter how good the journalists are at their jobs and how honest they are.
So what do you like, how do you think of that 50%, news that's not on point, that like you were talking earlier about how there's like a very clear separation between opinion writers and journalists in your mind. And I was sort of, as you were saying that, I was like, well, it seems, obviously I'm not in the industry, I don't know, you probably have a much more sophisticated perspective on this, but to me, it's like, it seems like more of a spectrum. And maybe that's me conflating the fact that 50% of news is sort of missing. And I don't mean missing, I mean like it's 50% is hitting and 50% is missing in terms of what's right and what's accurate. And I'm looking at that piece that's missing and sort of attributing an opinion to what, in some cases why that's wrong, why it's BS. But maybe
Right.
you think about that a little bit differently.
Yeah. So what am I saying? So what I'm saying is um that for opinion writing, it's not even possible to quantify how much is right and how much is wrong, because a lot of it is just not even wrong. It's just bullshit. It's just narratives like that you can't be falsified,
Hmm.
right? And I write those narratives too. I try to stick to facts as much as I can, but people want a narrative to feel like they understand things. And I've got to, provide that narrative. And sometimes and in fact, there are narratives that are more useful and less useful. But there are so many narratives that we'll never be able to have rigorous scientific tests of which narratives are useful and which aren't, except in a very few conditions. So, you know, we're spinning narratives isn't all I do. A lot of people think that that's opinion writer's main job, when in fact it's only part of it. Opinion writers synthesize a lot of different sources to get a clear picture of what's going on. But that picture, in order to communicate that picture to people, if you're going to make people understand what's actually going on, you're going to have some pieces of that communication are going to have to be bullshit. And when I say bullshit, what I mean is not lies or anything that's incorrect. It's stuff that is just sort of made up, and it doesn't matter whether it's correct or not.
Hmm.
And so that bullshit is necessary for putting real information into people's minds. It's a conduit that allows you to get information into people's minds, because it allows them to nod along and say, aha, I understand this thing. And then the information fits into like that framework and doesn't just bounce off their skulls. And they're like, okay, what does that mean? So in other words, explanation is always part bullshit. And this is true of scientific theories to a greater degree than anyone realizes, by the way. So in a way, we're just making up little scientific theories of like current events on the fly. But so for opinion writers, it's not even possible to talk about like 50% right, 50% wrong. Okay. But I would say that there's some opinion writers out there whose frameworks are just totally broken, and who would just see the world through a lens that's just totally inadequate to allowing them to understand things. Like the people who saw the Silicon Valley Bank collapse this week and blamed it on wokeness. If you saw that, they're like,
You're
oh,
you're making you're making my transition for me, so keep going.
yeah, they had diversity statements. That must be why their bank collapsed. Well, no, it wasn't. That had nothing to do with it. It's just like that's what these people talk about. That's how they understand the world. That's their lens through which they view the world. And it's a lens that I consider pretty useless. Like yes, there's wokeness. There's some things that happen because of wokeness, but like most stuff doesn't happen because of wokeness. And you're really just sort of like you're taking your chosen lens and just applying it in appropriately to just everything you see. And so I think that that's what I would, but you can't call that wrong. It's just like I would call it stupid, but my job is sort of proving that that's stupid. Well, what better explanation do you have? If it's not wokeness, tell us what it is. And so that's what my job is, right? I have to give people a better alternative to those unhelpful kind of narrative frameworks.
Yeah, one interesting thing, I'm not sure if this is, how well this would work, but if you see a given opinion writer that is constantly blaming or, attributing the causes of situations to the same thing or the same couple of things, maybe, I mean, on the one hand, you could say that those things are genuinely so, you know, core, that they're driving everything, and maybe that would be the counter that these people would try to make. But it would seem like a lot of things that happen, um, should have at least somewhat, like, you shouldn't be able to attribute every situation to the same root problem, probably. There's probably at least some unique causes to various things or separate causes to things. And so when you see someone just take the classic narrative of this is a woke problem or whatever it is, to the same to a different problem, and they just keep applying it to different problems, it's like I start to get a little bit skeptical of that maybe. But you wrote a couple of pieces on the Silicon Valley Bank situation. I'm sure there's more to come. And I read them today, sort of after the storm of the last few days. We're recording on Tuesday, March 14th. And basically the last 5 or 6 days were sort of the thick of things, at least so it seems thus far. And a lot of your stuff, held up really well. Most people were predicting, for example, that there would be a buyout, Sunday night or something like that of Silicon Valley Bank, so that all the depositors would get some amount of money back, immediately as opposed to over time. And there was speculation, maybe it'd be 50% Monday, maybe it'd be 80%, whatever. And you were writing about how, it's probably more likely to be 100% just to prevent anything systemic from happening, and that the government could step in directly, that there doesn't need to be an acquirer. So I think one interesting way to sort of transition the conversation we've been having about the changing media landscape to this specific event is to sort of just hear behind the scenes. We could talk about the event itself as well, obviously, but the behind the scenes of like something like this happens. How do you collect your information? How do you compile it? How do you summarize it, decide what you're going to write about? Just like your whole process of information collection and then writing, because obviously, you're prolific, and some of these pieces that you're writing are more, independent from current events at the given time. They're obviously loosely related, but this is like a breaking news thing where you are, picking up the pieces as they come, and information changes in real time. I think your second piece was like an hour or two before, the
Or exactly what I predicted was in fact announced.
Exactly. So it's like very real time. And I'm just curious to hear how all of that plays out behind the scenes.
Oh, why did I think that was going to happen? Well, I had seen a Washington Post scoop, from a friend who's a reporter at the Washington Post who has inside sources, saying that this is one thing they were contemplating doing. So it sounded very likely to me that this would be done. Just knowing the general principles here and reasoning that we had learned from 2008. In 2008, we let Lehman fail because a bunch of people were like, well, how are you going to bail these guys out? And it turned out we had to do a lot more bailouts later because we let Lehman fail. I think that we learn our lessons. We don't always learn them quickly or exactly right, but we do learn. And when I saw people proposing this deposit backstop, and I realized how cheap it would be, right? I realized that this isn't going to cost the taxpayer money. And it's pretty minimal intervention, actually. It's just formalizing a deposit guarantee that had been informal since the crisis. For over a decade now, we've like always made sure depositors get all their money back informally, and now we're just going to do it formally, at least in this situation. I thought, okay, well, so it's a minimal intervention. It's not really different from what we're already doing. Just sort of publicly announcing this and creating this like bank funding mechanism to make sure it's all just like formalized is not that big a step. And everybody's going to be scared that this could be another Lehman. I don't think it could be another Lehman, but you don't want a 5% chance of another Lehman. That could screw your economy. It doesn't do a lot of harm to sort of formalize the kind of guarantee of deposits that we'd informally had since 2008. And so I thought they're probably going to do this. Like I was giving them in my mind like a 95% chance of doing it. And then they did it 2 hours later. So like I was right. But I knew exactly what they were considering, and I knew why it would be an attractive option to them. And I couldn't think of a better alternative, except, I couldn't think of any alternative that they would do unless they just made a gigantic mistake.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, okay, well, this is what they'll probably do. And that was right.
Yeah, it's interesting. The informally making sure the depositors get 100% of their deposits was something I saw, like, you linked a Google sheet in one of your pieces, and that was really interesting to take a look at, just to see like actually, here are all of the cases of bank failures, because people don't hear about bank failures on a day-to-day basis. So when, one is slapped on the cover of mainstream media and all over your Twitter, and you're seeing it's the third biggest one, and the first one was Lehman, and the second one was Washington Mutual or whatever, you're like, and it's 2008, you're like, okay, this seems, pretty bad. You assume it's somewhat unprecedented, and you start to just, people start to panic. Everyone's saying, take your money out of the banks, the small banks, and move it to the big banks, all this stuff. You see a sheet like that that shows, yeah, these bank failures haven't been as big as Silicon Valley Bank in terms of their assets, but in almost all of these cases, people have gotten above and beyond the FDIC guaranteed 250K, no problem. It starts to add a bit of reassurance, I think. Um, and, you start to think, well, this isn't maybe something as different as what we've seen in the past, but at the same time, the fact that it feels different to a lot of people may be enough to like psychologically, panic can create the bank run in and of itself. Um, so even as of, yesterday, I was like just sort of crossing my fingers that no other balls dropped because, like we just, you didn't really know what was going to happen exactly. Even if the facts were the facts, like people could panic and bank runs are self-fulfilling. And it just felt like a bit of a precarious position to be in. So anyway, you don't see this as being something that's super systemic or putting, the US economy at any material risk in the near term. Is that a right read of sort of how you're seeing things right now?
Um, yeah, yeah. I think the bigger problem that has nothing to do with SVB or the current deposit measure that they took. The bigger problem here is just that raising interest rates makes treasury bonds, long dated treasury bonds, like 10-year treasuries, whatever, lose value, right? They lose their value, which makes banks more vulnerable to runs. So because if your assets are worth less, then you can't get as much cash for them in a quick sale. So if people yank their deposits, you can't get as much cash to pay them. So that lowers the amount of deposits that people have to yank in order to bring down any given bank. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So the raising interest rates lowers the value of long dated treasuries. And that has weakened our financial system, and yet inflation's still running hot. So we're going to have to do more interest rate hikes, which means more weaknesses for banks, which means that we are probably going to end up having to guarantee all unsecured deposits, at least until the inflationary episode is over, because raising interest rates will just make banks less and less solvent. And Silicon Valley Bank was just the canary in the coal mine in this sense.
Yeah. So what do you think about, the Fed can guarantee all deposits, but and that can give people confidence that I can stay with, my medium-sized or small bank and not have to worry about losing my deposit. But is there
Uh-huh.
any, like despite them guaranteeing that, wouldn't it be reasonable? This is the part I don't really get as of now. Like, you know, I obviously want my deposits to be safe. I don't see any reason to not move my money to a big bank where it seems to be, even safer, even if they're saying, my deposits are good with the medium and small banks. If I play things out and a lot of banks are in trouble due to the rate hikes, and the Fed says they're gonna backstop all the deposits and everything's fine, but if I don't really trust them, I wouldn't ordinarily want to like spread this on a big platform or anything. I don't have that many listeners. It doesn't make a difference. But um, like if I'm thinking, okay, well, so some more, they continue the hikes, some more banks are going down. At some point, are they going to have to pull back on the, we're doing this in perpetuity? Like I think they only earmarked what, like 25 billion or something. That covers
Oh,
like the start, but there's like this broader bank
no,
run
no,
that I
no.
think it would be good.
It's much more than that. The insurance fund basically it can go up a lot higher than 25 billion.
Like
The
how high?
25 billion is something else. It's like the government's sort of $25 billion of guarantee. It's too annoying to explain. It's boring. The point is that this isn't like a simple ways of understanding. It's like, oh, it's a $25 billion bailout. Well, no, it's not. In
Sure.
fact, it might just be like it's probably just it's a $0 bailout because SVB is probably solvent. And so sure, it had lost money on bonds, but probably what it has left is enough to pay the depositors or almost. So like the actual cost of it will be either zero or very small, and that cost will be borne by other banks.
Right. Okay. Well, I sort of, we ended up talking about media for a while and don't want to go too deep into this issue because we're coming up on time, but I wanted to end with separate thing that something you've written quite a bit about. It's why you're sort of um, taking a techno-optimistic view on the 2020s. You said that when you first started the Substack, this was going to be like a main thing that was sort of important to you to be explicitly techno-optimist. And you wrote a piece, like, techno-optimism for the 2020s, which talked about, space and energy. And I can't remember if it was talking too much about AI or if that was some of your more recent posts about 2023 and whatnot. But to end on sort of more an optimistic note, curious, if you could give sort of like a general outlook about what's exciting these days, what you're paying attention to, and what you're most optimistic about technologically for the several years ahead.
Oh, well, so I don't want to push techno optimism where it's not warranted, right? Like I don't want to force myself to be optimistic. I just am optimistic. I think that there's so, you know, we have we have a self-regulating technological system. It's not really self-regulating. What happens is that when progress starts to run out, we put a lot of effort into finding new things and opening up new fields. And so there was, when progress in bigger engines, faster airplanes, faster cars, more power hungry appliances, all those sort of physical, progress came to a halt in the 1970s. Rapid progress in those energy intensive technologies came to a halt when energy got more expensive after the oil shock of 1973. And for a while there was a productivity slowdown, and we said, oh my God, we need to invent more stuff. And so we poured a lot of resources in inventing something of a different type, which was IT. So we invented, computers and the internet and smartphones and, spreadsheets and blah, blah, blah. And that wave of innovation is still going to some extent. I mean, you see AI now coming out. I think GPT-4 just came out today or yesterday. And so you still see some of that innovation going, but I think a lot of that is slowing down. There's like a marginal benefit. Almost everyone has a smartphone now. There's a marginal benefit from cramming more apps on it. You can't spend any more time on social media than we already do. Businesses are now fully digitized, all these things. You can make slightly better like SaaS business apps, whatever. So there's still some progress, just as there's been some progress in airplanes and cars and appliances since 1973, but the progress is just slowing. And so, but I think we have, except in AI, that's like the only IT rapid progress IT thing, because that was sort of a later field that got opened up. But I think that we've started to pour resources into other things. We've started to pour resources into energy tech with batteries and solar and hydrogen and all other kinds of cool stuff. But I think batteries are the most interesting one. We started to pour resources into biotech with mRNA vaccines and CRISPR and blah, blah. And of course we poured resources into AI, but those sort of, and space to some degree, right? We're making space launch cheaper. But I think that, energy, biotech, and AI are probably the three biggies. And, when our IT, our IT revolution started slowing down, as soon as it started slowing down, this is a couple decades ago, as soon as we could sort of see that this was going to slow down, we started just pouring resources into these other things, and now it's come to fruition. And the amazing vaccination effort, the COVID vaccination effort, is just the first of many such things. You'll soon be able to grow your organs in a lab, whatever. Cool stuff in biotech, gene edit your kids, make your dog immortal. I don't know. That cool stuff's going to happen there. Energy technology is going to be super portable. You're going to have little drones and robots flying around, and finally have the robot future everyone's been wanting. Cheap space launch could take us to Mars. I don't know if that actually makes any economic sense, but I think we'll be able to do it. I think, and then of course AI is gonna write a bunch of stuff for us and design a bunch of stuff and just do cool things like that, plus a whole bunch of predictive, stuff that seems almost like magic. Between all those things, I'm really optimistic about the increase in our capabilities. Now, the one note of caution I'll say is that new technologies often get used for evil. They get used for war and destruction. Industrial technology got used for World War II, And I think we're now seeing how information technology can be used to create a world of misinformation, as well as doing things like cyber attacks, but especially just to spread lies everywhere. I think we're now seeing that, and I think trust in media has going down has something to do with that, and I think that we will see the new technologies used for evil. We're going to see people try to make bioweapons. We're going to see people use, batteries and AI to do like killer drones, killer robots. We're going to see, AI probably accelerate. It'll be a force multiplier for the internet liars, for just the people spreading misinformation on the internet. And so we're going to see all kinds of bad uses by bad people. So being a techno-optimist means I'm optimistic that we will be able to create all this cool stuff. That doesn't mean that I think that every use that people put it to is going to be good, right? Many people will put technology to bad uses, just as they have for every technology we've ever created in the past. And we just have to we have to rearrange our society so as to minimize the bad uses of technology and maximize the good ones, so that technology becomes a purely beneficial force, or as much as we can make it.
Yeah, no, definitely it can be used for good or bad, and I think it's a good place to leave off. A lot for people to consider, and we're up on time. But I want to thank you anyway for coming on, and interesting going back and forth on a bunch of these things, a bunch more I could talk about. But great hearing your perspective on all of this. And where can people go if they want to follow you on Twitter, or read your Substack, everything like that?
Oh yes, I mean my Substack is called No Opinion, NOAHPINION. There's no O in the middle. Sometimes people hallucinate an O, but it's just No Opinion. And that's the name of the Substack. You can Google it, or you can go to noopinion.substack.com. And then Twitter, my Twitter handle is the exact same. It's just No Opinion.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Noah. Great talking with you, and appreciate you taking the time.
Cool. Thanks so much for having me on.